This summer marks the 20th anniversary for one of the best and most influential superhero films ever made. That used to be a non-negotiable fact, but as the years go by and more reboots and remakes and multiverses come out, it's actually worthy of a debate now. I'll go ahead and say that both Spider-Verse films are the best Spider-Man movies, although they do have the advantage of being animated. Beautifully animated, mind you, but they still have that advantage over the live-action films. And I'm just throwing that out there now because I know someone in the comments is gonna say something about it as if I don't already agree. So, throwing those animated pictures aside, this baby is a masterpiece. It's one of those movies that not only gets better with multiple viewings, but as I grow older with it, the meaning of the film changes for me. I think that's the real power that this movie has, and not really one that you would expect from a comic film, and that's what really surprised people back then. But if you really think about it, that's what Spider-Man was about in the first place. So, to celebrate this film's anniversary, let's take a look at the backstory behind it, the film itself, and the legacy it left behind. So sit back, grab a snack, and enjoy. The first Spider-Man movie was pretty insane given all the production stories behind it, the anxieties of the whole project, and the end result, which I also find to be quite magnificent. This was the early 2000s when superhero films were on the rise, thanks to this new era of advanced filmmaking. Before this, there were a lot of DC films that were pretty damn good. I'd even argue that Superman is up there with near-perfect adaptations, but it has shown a bit of age. For me, that's part of the charm, but maybe younger viewers wouldn't dig it as much. Whereas these films are only around 20 years old now. Oh my god. There were a lot of Marvel screen productions done in the 90s, some of which really didn't pan out like intended.
He's a special observer sent by President Roosevelt.
Oh, remarkable work, Dr. Naselli. Congratulations.
Even before there were live-action television series, even one that was intended for Spider-Man, but didn't quite land.
So I was disappointed in it.
Marvel wasn't doing too great economically, which isn't a very unfamiliar story for comic books at the time. We did see a sort of renaissance in the 90s, particularly with the Fox animations, Spider-Man, X-Men, all of these shows, which were incredible, but even more so brought this wider attention to these characters and stories to larger audiences. Even way back in the day with the older cartoons and even the live action series, those shows really brought those characters to larger audiences as not everyone was keen on reading comic books. Comic books are a kind of magical thing because they can be insanely goofy and ridiculous, also bring in really deep themes and storylines all within the same book. The 90s and 2000s and really the late 80s saw these more serious storylines and more intense writing and artwork to match the general attitude that people were having at this time. For a lot of us, these are the best years of comics, and the shows reflected that as well. And at the end of the 90s, so did the movies. Blade is really the one that kickstarted everything, and yes, there were films previous, but for Marvel, Blade was actually good, and a lot of people really dug it. A good chunk of viewers at the time probably didn't even know who the character was until seeing the film. It was pretty bizarre because while it did embody some of the comic action you would expect, it was also an R-rated film with blood, gore, and other adult themes. There was this notion going around that these stories were really meant for kids, especially considering the backlash with Batman Returns.
It was very violent. It was a total attack against kids, the whole movie. Everything that kids love was being used against them.
You think it was scary then?
Definitely for kids.
It was pretty ambitious. While that movie really was the big kickstart for Marvel, Many see The Matrix, while not inherently being a comic film, really revolutionize things and set the modern template for the superhero film. Around that time, Columbia had gotten the rights for Spider-Man, and it wouldn't be until 2002 that the film finally was released. As I said, it was a crazy production, but the end result warmed the hearts of millions of fans. The film was heralded by Sam Raimi, most famously known for his horror films, but he was also a huge Spider-Man fan and knew how to tell a damn good Spider-Man story. That and the amazing screenplay by David Coep, one that had the dazzle you would want, while also putting its focus on the emotional weight of the character, something that Spider-Man 2 amplifies. It's one of those movies where when you hear the score, the hairs on the back of your neck start to raise, and you just get this feeling of nostalgic bliss. It was damn near perfect. The casting, the writing, the visual spectacle of the whole thing. It was the type of superhero film that fans have been dreaming of finally actualized. The reception of the film was unprecedented. It was the first movie to break 100 million in the box office in a weekend. It most certainly raised a new bar for superhero films, and it was absolutely no surprise at all that a sequel would need to be made. Usually, sequels are bad or pointless, but we're talking about comic book characters here. There are hundreds of stories, many of them are actually great, that could be turned into good films. The first movie didn't really focus on a particular storyline from the comic outside of the obvious origin story. It was rather smart. It mixed elements from different iterations and molded them to a story that modernizes the character and translated it to film. Obvious inspirations, of course, are the original Amazing Spider-Man comic and the Ultimate series, which is my personal favorite that I grew up with. That series brought in factors such as Harry, MJ, and Peter all being high school classmates, and the dual origin of Norman and Peter. Still, there are many characters and stories that would make for so many good opportunities for a sequel. The first film went strong by having Green Goblin be Peter's first supervillain. Green Goblin's first appearance was Amazing 14, but has since been seen as Spider-Man's arch-nemesis. I never really saw them having the same dynamic as Superman and Lex Luthor, or Batman and the Joker. That's why I never really say Spider-Man has one arch-nemesis. It usually comes down to Goblin, Octavius, or Venom. You're more than welcome to debate which you feel is his greatest nemesis. Anywho, it seemed that the idea of Octavius being the next villain was pretty much a given. He was even considered in the early conceptions of the first film. The sequel was ordered before Spider-Man 1 had even released. Raimi hired Alfred Goh and Miles Miller to write the story for the sequel. But for those who don't know, these were the developers for the hit TV show. One of my favorite TV shows at all time, and I just cannot believe I learned this making this video. Smallville. It blows my mind, and it really puts a lot of things into perspective when looking at this film. Smallville, for those who don't know, was a show that is more than deserving of its own behemoth of a video. Was a series about young Clark Kent growing up into his powers from teenage years to early adulthood. And then maybe a couple years longer than it should have, but it still was pretty good. It was a Superman series not about Superman. It was Clark Kent, the human-raised alien farm boy who is in constant struggles with his identity, his powers, and the overall horror of being a literal god with a heart of gold. It goes without saying that the show was more focused on the characters than the broader superhero subject, and that really shines in this film. Raimi and Maguire apparently were both big fans of Smallville. I recall in the commentary for the first Spider-Man film that Maguire said he was a bigger Superman fan when it came to superheroes. The screenwriter of the first film, David Coep, was involved in the early drafts. He wanted to focus on Harry taking the Green Goblin mantle. This also included introducing and killing Gwen in the same film. Introducing Gwen I think was actually a good idea, given that Peter is in his college days now, but killing her off in the same movie? Not such a good idea. That doesn't really give us a lot of screen time to invest ourselves with that character. I might be throwing myself under the bus here, but I definitely shipped Peter and Gwen more in the original comic, and I found out she died by reading it, actually, in a library before the days of the internet telling you everything. And it shocked my child self reading that. It was even more shocking because it didn't just happen right away, it was quite a bit into the actual story. I guess Raimi felt the same and hired Michael Chabon to rewrite the story, going back to bringing Octavius into the fold. The original idea for Octavius was to make him a bit younger, not so much Peter's age, but closer to it, and have him be obsessive over MJ. How original! He tries to use his arms to, I guess, be heroic. MJ is being mugged again, and then Doc Ock destroys the muggers, kind of playing on the original scene where Peter saves MJ and gets a little kiss in the rain. Here it's a bit more villainous. Ock's arms start to kill him, and he needs Spider-Man's blood or something to live, in which he teams up with Harry and the Daily Bugle to hunt Spider-Man down. Apparently, somehow, Doc was also the creator of the spider that bit Peter. Weird being a younger Ock, but hey, that again is pretty similar to the Ultimate series. So Raimi had a lot of material to pick and choose from, but he knew ultimately that he wanted to focus on Peter's personal life. There were multiple inspirations for the plot we ultimately got, many of which were comic storylines from the original book, which Raimi has more knowledge of, still in the early years of Spider-Man. If This Be My Destiny, famous for being the first long-running single story, being 3 books long, sees Peter enter college, meeting Gwen Stacy and Harry Osborn for the first time, all of which who think Peter is an arrogant asshole. But the reality is, his Aunt May had been hospitalized as her health was deteriorating, and his mind was too focused on that, and his Spider-Man duties, that he couldn't really be sociable or was even really aware of what was going on around him. Because he had that absorption into his roles as Spider-Man and his responsibilities as Peter, those conflicts are brought into this film, and that's also a Doc Ock story as well. There's a very famous moment in the storyline that I think is familiar to nearly every Spider-Man iteration. And of course, Amazing 50, Spider-Man No More, a line he actually says in the film, with one of the most iconic cover arts for a comic, also played a role in Peter's struggle with his identities in this film. In the story, Peter throws away his costume and enjoys the life of being a 20-year-old college student for a brief period before remembering his responsibilities and returning to the suit. We had seen a similar story on screen before in Superman 2, in which Raimi himself also stated was an influence for this film. Raimi decided to make some altercation to Doc Ock's backstory, to make him a more sympathetic character, and to have a better dynamic with Peter that benefited the film's narrative. In between Spider-Man films, Tobey had done Seabiscuit, which had agitated a back condition that he had, and the studios were actually considering replacing him with Jake Gyllenhaal, who would actually end up playing Mysterio later on in the MCU. Apparently Jake was considered because he and Tobey both look alike. I don't see that at all in the slightest. Also, Maguire and Kirsten Dunst had broken up as a couple, and Raimi feared that that would hinder their chemistry in this film. There is some truth to that, but I actually think that benefited the film even more. It's more mature, not to mention a major plot point being that Peter is unreliable and kept pushing MJ away. There should be a sense of that between these characters. We want a sense of change over the time span between these films, and we get that. Much of the cast of the first film returned for the sequel. Franco as Harry, Rosemary Harris as Aunt May, Elizabeth Banks as Betty Brant, J.K. Simmons as JJ, and there are plenty of newcomers as well. Of course, Doc Ock was the big one. There were quite a bit of actors up for the role, which included Chris Cooper and Christopher Walken. Think about that for a moment. I'll admit, Alfred Molina was a bit weird of a choice to think of at the time for the role. Doc Ock, to this point, had a specific look to him. one that the film replaced for a more grounded and less cartoony one. One of the complaints that the first film got was the Power Ranger style costume of the Green Goblin, which we now know wasn't the initial design, but it was a little odd. Raimi saw the potential in Molina and thought he had a great build for the character. And he was right. Molina's performance as Ock is iconic.
The power of the sun in the palm of my hand.
The filming started in April of 2003, all the way through to December with reshoots. The film utilized the SpiderCam system, a cable-based camera rig. This system was used to give those shots of Spider-Man flying through the city with his web swinging, so that we, the audience, can feel as if we're flying with him. Raimi had used the system once before, which was still somewhat new at the time, for Spider-Man 1, for the final shot, which is the only real shot that shows him swinging around like that. A lot of Spider-Man swinging was pretty hidden in the first film, and the first major web swinging scene was done with less perfection because the camera was meant to match how Spider-Man's movements were imperfect, and he was learning as he went. The camera gives us that same feeling because of how it follows his movements. It helps make the digital body of Spider-Man feel more real and tangible by having him interact with a more real backdrop of the city. In terms of the costumes, there were quite a bit of changes done to Spidey's suit. The colors were bolder now, and the eyes were a little bit smaller, and the muscles had less stiffness to them. Doc Ock's arms were done by puppeteers, in which Molina addressed each arm as such, and you could see in the film how they do sort of embody their own personalities. The top right arm was actually one that handles the more delicate interactions, such as taking off his glasses. That one was done by the only female grip on the puppeteer team. CG was used, but for economic interest, they wanted to use the practical arms as much as they could. The film released at the end of June of 2004 to an opening box office of $40 million, $1 million more than Spider-Man 1 made on its opening weekend. The film would ultimately hit just under $800 million in the overall box office. With a budget of $200 million, that's pretty good. Critics and audiences alike all adored the film and came to the similar conclusion on why it's so damn good. So let's break it down. Peter Parker. Spider-Man is the title character, but he's also the burden of the protagonist. The first film puts its focus on, with great power comes great responsibility. That responsibility seemed more like, I have the power to help people, so I'll do that. Peter learns at the end of the film just how dangerous knowing his identity is, as it almost killed Mary Jane, Aunt May, and a bunch of civilians, just so Norman could make a point to Peter. Because of that, Peter has effectively cut himself off from the people he loves the most because he fears for their safety, and because he genuinely doesn't have the time to see them anymore. Being Spider-Man is an enormous chore, but even more so, he lives in New York City. That place is expensive. Being a college student with no deep pockets backing him, working 2 jobs, both of which are humiliating and demoralizing to someone who is literally risking his life every day. The film opens with our incredible hero in kind of a similar spot that he was at the beginning of the first film, except now he's working as a pizza delivery boy, still dreaming over his high school crush, when Betty is literally right there. The way I would have folded right there. It is a pretty big step down from the previous film where he lived with Harry. Peter tried to be independent, but Norman and Harry really were carrying him for quite a bit in the city. Now he has to work 2 crappy jobs just to live in an even worse environment. I like how the film countered the perception of Spider-Man delivering pizzas with Spider-Man being perceived as stealing those pizzas. After all, even though he's a hero who saves the city, most of the city still sees him as a menace. A lot of that is due to the influence of Peter's boss, JJ. Someone who actually likes heroes and mutants, but despises Spider-Man. Unfortunately, he's Peter's main source of income. Peter has to work for a man whose career is spent bashing him for all the hard work he does, and gets awful pay for it.
I'll give you 150.
300.
That's outrageous. Done.
Not to mention how much of an ass JJ is in general. But J.K. Simmons' iconic performance of the character actually makes him likable even as an ass in the film.
But could you pay me in advance?
I don't think I've ever liked Jameson in any iteration of Spider-Man stories, aside from these. Peter loses his pizza job because he was delayed, saving the lives of 2 children who almost ended up in a pet cemetery situation, and just barely missed his delivery time. And then JJ is constantly firing Peter because he doesn't want to give him any juicy pictures of Spider-Man, knowing that JJ will just continue to write bad things in the paper. Even though he really is a good photographer who has the insane advantages for compositions given his abilities. But it doesn't sell as well, sadly. I really love these type of transitions they do here.
You're fired. Parker, hello. You're fired.
So after taking the abuse of the city and his boss, he must also deal with the fact that he's losing his friends. To top off all the bad things that have happened to Peter, it's also his birthday. And this is the first time he's gotten to see his friends in a while. Harry has grown incredibly bitter and torn over the fact that he believes Spider-Man killed his father, and Peter does have a strange connection with Spider-Man being able to take his photos. I feel everyone in this room has some haunting suspicion that Peter is Spider-Man. MJ kinda already guessed it with the kiss at the end of the movie, and Harry has known Peter for literal years, and Aunt May is Aunt May. She doesn't like Spider-Man initially, but after he saves her life, well, how could you not recognize your own nephew you raised?
Henry and I agree. We don't see his picture in the paper anymore.
It's actually interesting to think about how many people already know or suspect Peter of being Spider-Man, but don't want to say anything for the same reason he keeps his identity a secret. Even still, it's hard to believe, so they need a little extra actual evidence for them to solidify their theories. Peter lives with the extra guilt that not only did Norman die by his own insanity, but that he also has to keep it a secret from Harry.
Don't tell Harry.
Which I can't help but figure that that isn't a good look for his already sketchy public image. Another layer of the burdens the mask puts on him. Even though Harry tries to keep face, his obvious hatred for Spider-Man pushes Peter away, costing him his once best friend. And then the reveal at the end prepares us for another famous comic storyline. It was definitely a better idea to play this out instead of rushing into it like the original conception for the film. I really like how they used Harry in this movie. It feels like a genuine down spiral for his character. One who didn't really care about his father's company, wasn't the best at school, and would have preferred a more fun lifestyle. But with the death of his father, he too had the burden of responsibility thrown onto him, now running Oscorp. But it seems he had more economic ambition in mind over the love for science. Not to mention he's also just jealous of the fact that Norman liked Peter more than him. Then there's poor Aunt May, growing older and alone. Having spent her whole life with Uncle Ben, she's left with a major hole in her heart, and I wouldn't trust the person who isn't moved by Rosemary Harris's performance. She too is struggling financially, close to losing her home, and broken up that she can't support Peter. The older I get, the more painful this scene of them fighting over $20 gets. As a kid, I couldn't fully comprehend how much $20 makes a difference as an adult.
You need it more than I do.
No, I can't take that.
Yes, you can. You can take this money from me. For God's sake, it's not much. Now take it.
It's even more heartbreaking that, given her entire situation, May still wants to give what little she has to her precious nephew. This will forever be the best portrayal of Aunt May. Even in the original comics, she was a pretty flat character, mostly the old caretaker that occasionally fell ill when the plot needed her to, or to further in Spider-Man bashing for Peter, or to marry Doc Ock that one time. Ugh. Over different stories, she's really expanded as a character in different directions. Now, Raimi doesn't go that in-depth with it, but it's still a far more investing version of the character than the original comics. And again, Rosemary's performance just makes the character so real. Oh, MJ. I'm not a huge MJ fan in general, but she is a compelling character given the right writer. MJ is a character with her own dreams and ambitions. She cannot revolve her entire life around Peter, even though she definitely tries to reel him back in, but his resistance becomes daunting and eventually she has to move on. There's no point in chasing after someone who is constantly rejecting you or ignoring you. It's painful for us to know Peter loves MJ more than anything, I don't know why, and that's why he does this. We could scream at the TV for him to just tell her, because she'll understand, and she will. She will, but you gotta think, she almost died before, without knowing. And it turns into this whole discussion of, is it fair to keep that from her because you're underestimating how she'll handle it or how strong she is as a person. There's the chance that she'll know the danger that she's in, but won't give up that easily and will push through with it, because she is a strong character. Peter and MJ's relationship drama has been the heart of many of Spider-Man stories, from constant breakups to near-death experiences to radioactive spider baby gravy. An interesting example to consider, yet again, the Ultimate series, which in that series brought in the idea of her being a high school sweetheart versus the original where she was the girl next door that Peter didn't even know existed till he was already in college. The Ultimate series actually has Peter tell MJ incredibly early. So early that she is the first person that he tells, and she's more than excited about it, and is willing to share his burden with him. Until the Green Goblin almost kills her. And for a while, she starts to suffer from PTSD from the incident. Keep in mind that they are still teenagers. I think that she's still 15 by this point. And she can't tell anyone what's bothering her, which eventually does break their relationship for a bit. It really is a double-edged sword situation, and we should understand Peter's resistance for telling her this. That said, people have looked at MJ in these particular films at not such a likable light. She certainly has gone through the totem pole, first dating a jock, then the rich kid, who she was pretty much ready to leave for Peter. Let's chalk that up to another divide in their friendship. And then Jameson's son, who is an astronaut, an American hero. Another reason why JJ hates on old Spidey, because in his eyes, his son is a real hero, whereas Spidey is just a vigilante playing hero. Anyway, her relationship with Jameson seems more for show. She doesn't really seem interested in him and is more interested in Peter. Even though she's engaged to the guy, she still wants Peter to kiss her to prove a theory. So yeah, I feel bad for Jameson because he's really just a tool for MJ. The film really wanted to focus on the tradition of the Peter and MJ relationship, which I can respect that. But the sacrifice does come at MJ not really being that great. Peter had many more options that would have been less toxic, but the heart wants what the heart wants. These stories are maturing as the characters get older and relationships become more complicated. People become more complicated. By the way, this is a Spider-Man movie. The drama is so compelling because there are levels of relatability to it. Having to sacrifice time with our friends for our jobs or for school, struggling to keep those relationships, struggling to survive with deadbeat jobs, that's why people love Spider-Man so much. He isn't some privileged rich kid who can build whatever he wants, nor is he a hero with such great abilities that he can juggle a double life. It takes the idea of the superhero so real that it feels real. It's not as campy as you would expect from a comic film. It's handled with such seriousness to the duality of Peter's life. The film shows that being a hero really can suck. Movies will glorify all the cool powers and gadgets. Spider-Man focuses on an isolated, broke kid who even after getting his powers still has a rough life. It's just more relatable for the reader or the viewer. We can sympathize more with Peter. That's what this film understood so well, so damn well. Now the villain. Dr. Otto Octavius has always been a great villain for Peter, genius in intellect and worthy in combat, but he has never been a character to really feel that sympathetic for. The film really changed that. This isn't the first time Octavius has been a hero to Peter, but this time it does feel more personal. Octavius is reflective of what Peter wants, a man chasing his ambition in science, married in a happy relationship. Somewhere along the way, he found the balance. In the dinner scene with Peter and Octavius, he learns how Otto was a lot like him. Pretty introverted, but still managed to get Rosie. It's almost a picture-perfect reality. You can also really feel this nice bond between Peter and Otto. It's almost as if you think he'd hire him to work for him. I really love how much he towers over Toby when they first meet. This is literally someone he looks up to. There's also this nice detail of Peter genuinely laughing at Otto's awful joke. But Otto didn't just become a villain because he wanted to. I think this version is one of the most tormented iterations for the character. He loses his wife to his hubris, and his arms are now fused to his body, which is a common trope for the character, but his mind is shattered. The arms really start to take over. He made a chip that was supposed to keep them in line, but now it's gone, and their minds are sort of melded together. The gentle scientist is now a super terrorist who will stop at nothing but to see his ambition come true. An ambition that was originally made of noble intentions. The villain story does hold a lot of horror tropes where we can kind of see Raimi's origins bleed through into the film, not just the obvious Evil Dead moment in the hospital. Even the layer design is reminiscent of Caligari. I talked about before how they upgraded the tech behind this movie, and I think the cinematography does show some major changes in style, from better depth of field, smoother tracking, and overall the color is so much more defined. We get way more shots of Spidey actually swinging through the city, not only showing the progress of the craft of the film, but Peter's skills in general and how much he's honed his skills over 2 years. Something Raimi did incredibly well was have thematic sets. The colors of the rooms would be symbolic to said characters relevant to that area. The Parker home was meant to be shown in a visual manner that felt warm, loving, and caring. Just looking at that house was like eating grandma's cookies. And when we return to that home in the sequel, the colors are the same, but the lighting is much dimmer, and it has a much more cold and empty, somber feeling. You could say the same for Peter's dingy apartment. It's cracked, poorly lit, covered in shadow. Almost everything is there in one space. It's so tight and compact, so isolated. It is incredibly symbolic of Peter's own emotional state throughout this film. And even a little bit later, when he has his raindrops montage, it feels lighter and just a tad bit more cozy for that brief moment of happiness that he has. There are a lot of moments like that in this film when you finally think, hey, maybe things will look up for old Peter. And those very brief moments of hope, but the film never stops the parallel of Peter's lives. On that topic, the play that MJ is in, that she keeps trying to get Peter to go see, is The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. This is actually a really clever choice, as this is a story about a man who creates an alter ego so that he can go off and do whatever he wants without worrying about his responsibilities. Which just so happens to be what Peter ends up doing. After finally having enough of the burden of being Spider-Man, his identity crisis takes away his ability to be Spider-Man. We can break it down to being symbolic for his identity crisis, but it seems even more that he's actually being given a chance. Another chance to be normal and to decide for himself if that's what he really wants. As if his body was saying, if these powers are such a problem, then deal with life without them.
You once spoke to me about intelligence. That it was a gift to be used for the good of mankind.
The most important thing for Spidey to remember is that his powers are a blessing. His life would be way more worse without his powers, but he can make life a little bit better with them if he just learns to balance things. Just throwing his gifts away isn't the answer. There's a reason he was blessed with these powers, and considering how bad his life was before, he easily could have become another villain. But that's not the person he is, not inside. The whole loss of powers is nothing more than a test. Man, this really is Smallville. Even when he loses his powers, life doesn't really get better. He just has a montage of good things going, but that doesn't stop that MJ and Harry are still pissed at him. Aunt May is still broke, and his back is all messed up. The truth is, these problems still persist, with or without the powers. Peter does take these chances to start letting out some of the guilt he's been holding on to for these past few years, such as this incredibly painful scene with Aunt May. We know she doesn't hate or blame Peter, but it's a difficult thing to bring up. Even more painful is that May knows that for the last couple of years, Peter has been blaming himself for Ben's death all this time. The dynamic between these two, I can barely put into words how powerful it is seeing them together. Even back in the first film, such as the post-graduation scene, which is a real tearjerker, it reminds us the suffering that Peter's going through and how Spider-Man is both a means of redemption and a way to put his mind on something else. The most important thing we learn of Peter is that without his powers, he's still a hero. In what might be the most important scene of the film, Peter saves a young girl from dying in a burning building. He has no powers, and he's also not some strong athlete. He's back to being the weak Peter Parker. He struggles to get through the flames, he struggles to break down the door, he struggles to even see or breathe. But he still risks his life to save this child. After it all, he learns that there was another person trapped in the building who he couldn't save. But if he had his powers, he definitely would have had that chance. After realizing that he's lost way more than he initially thought, he's now desperate to get his powers back, and it takes the kidnapping of Mary Jane to rejuvenate him, leading to the train sequence. Watching this today still blows my mind. Apparently this was actually shot in Chicago because the building placements were more ideal. After losing the fight against the villain, he still manages to save the entire train of people, all of who do this weird Jesus thing to him, reminding him yet again that this is what it's all about. Sometimes the villains get away, sometimes they win, but protecting the city is what matters. Every single person on that train knows what he did. Furthermore, they all saw him unmasked and swore never to tell a soul. The finale continues Harry's arc, further pushing him into darkness. I feel like Franco's reaction here really gave that sense that I said before, that he always had that suspicion, always had that feeling maybe Peter could be, but just didn't want to believe it until he was forced to. It's a hard pill to swallow that your best friend killed your dad. Harry turning into the Green Goblin has been a pretty popular storyline from different iterations, and I think that any seasoned fan can predict the direction that it's going, even without this great scene here. There's always been different factors, whether it was forced onto him, drug abuse, or the ingenious way that Spectacular Spider-Man handled the character. The mantle tends to fall on him on some point, and it really leaves us with a sad feeling. Harry's always been shafted since Peter got his powers, and we don't want to see him turn bad. He was Peter's only friend, but their eventual fight is inevitable.
Huh?
At the end of the film, Peter's reveal is able to snap Otto back to sanity.
Sometimes, to do what's right, we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most. Even our dreams.
It wasn't necessarily Peter who saved him, but seeing Peter reminded Otto of the man he used to be, and he was able to fight his demons, clawing out to redemption. And in typical Raimi-verse fashion, is killed off for the story. But at least when these villains die, it feels like it matters. Mostly. As a kid, I never truly believed that he died, and always expected to see him come back again. It's kinda crazy how that actually played out. Peter's role model may have died, and he has destroyed his relationship with Harry, but at least he gets MJ. Yay. Look at her leaving her wedding, all happy with poor Jameson by himself at the altar. No wonder people write angry stuff about her. I mean, seriously, she had time, right? There's no way they did this wedding right after all of these happened. She must have had some time to cancel before this. And that wedding looked expensive too. Well, it's not a perfect ending, but Peter's life isn't perfect either. He still has to struggle being a normal guy and a hero. He's still broke, and there's a lot of loose ends for him. But at least the burden got a little lighter in the end. And that really is the best way to end this type of movie. Since its release, this film really changed how people viewed hero films. Even the successful ones were still on that campy note, but Spider-Man 2 showed us that these movies didn't have to follow certain tropes and could treat themselves more realistically. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to say it really set the groundwork for future hero films. Because at this point, there were still a lot of bad or mediocre ones being made. The craft hadn't been perfected yet. Whereas Spider-Man 2 is a movie that has something to offer all of us, those who love or hate these types of movies. I don't just think that this movie is the best hero movie, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. Returning to it really gets me through some tough spots. The lessons that it offers us, I still believe resonate, and I realize, yes, The Dark Knight exists. And yes, I love the Nolan films, I do. I think The Dark Knight is a masterpiece. But as a Batman fan, one before those movies existed, I do have certain gripes. And again, it's an incredible film, it just doesn't move me in the same way that this one does. It may not be as well crafted on the technical side, but what it does have to offer us is so important. But this is all looking at it from a perspective of someone who grew up with this movie. Things are different now. It's been 20 years since this film released, and hero movies have monopolized the theater, like it or not. But I do think people are starting to feel that fatigue, and I've noticed it in the craft as well. I don't really talk about this much, but I was a big MCU fan when it started, before I even knew what it was going to be. I saw Iron Man in theaters in 2008, and I had no idea what they were planning or what it would turn into. I just knew it was Iron Man, and he got a movie. A movie that too focused on deep themes and, at the time, real anxieties that audiences were having. And eventually that turned into the biggest series in the damn world. I've seen every MCU movie in theaters from Iron Man to Endgame. The last one I saw was the No Way Home movie, because of Tobey and Andrew's return. And I'll be honest with you, the child in me wept when I saw that film. It was primarily fan service, but the feelings that I recalled from these movies came back to me. The callback to this line tore me up, and I got choked up.
How are you?
Trying to do better.
It's really interesting now that there are so many different versions of this character on the big screen alone, and they have something different to offer each generation. I truthfully don't believe that a single version is a perfect adaptation of the character. When it comes down to what I admire most in these stories, Spider-Man 2 wins in that department. So when I'm asked what my favorite is, I say that. But you probably shouldn't, because these fandoms can tend to get pretty scary. And the kids growing up with the newer, more technically impressive versions have different perspectives on these characters. And I do get enjoyment from these films, I just wish that they could reflect on these themes more. I think the ending of No Way Home really went in that direction, and the fact that Peter sacrificed his actual existence to save everyone. That's a Peter Parker thing to do. Looking back at all the films that have anniversaries this year, it's easy to talk about how great they are, how important they are today, and how bad their remakes are. And I feel that it's more interesting in this particular argument. Of course, many will be incredibly stubborn on their own opinions. I can be too. Just don't attack people over it, okay? These are just movies. Maybe the kids who are growing up with the newer movies get the same ideas in a new modern sense that I'm out of touch with. I thought I would have too much of a nostalgic lens for this film, but I find that even people who are watching it for the first time still resonate with it in the same way. We remember these films for the memes, but there's so much more in these movies. That's really its best feature. It can make us laugh, it can make us think, and it can make us resonate with our anxieties and give us the strength to overcome them. Not everything will work out like a typical Hollywood script. Doesn't mean we should throw away everything and give up. We should see the blessings in our burdens. Work harder to find the balance in our lives. Life won't be perfect, but we can make it a little bit better. Did you see this film back when it came out? I'd love to hear if this movie helped you through some tough times, or if it had any impact on you. Leave me a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.